Welcome to the Agents Angle, taking more than a cursory glance at the football agent world, not just from the perspective of agents and FIFA, but also from that of many others, including players, coaches and clubs. With me, Jonathan Booker.
And me, Peter Paleologus. In this episode, we are joined by a representative, arguably one of the biggest stakeholder organisations in the football world, and seek to unravel some of the conundrums, myths and misunderstandings that often surround their organisation.
And if you thought FIFA were resting on their laurels when it comes to the enforcement of football agent regulations, there are reports of an investigation into agent-related matters, yet FIFA may be unable to exercise any jurisdiction.
All that to come on this episode of The Agents Angle.
And after quite an intense episode last time around, we hope this week to bring you something a little more relaxed, but hopefully no less informative or interesting. But last week's episode and the topic of the Advocate General's opinion on matters relating to FIFA and the football agent regulations at the European Court of Justice has certainly prompted a lot of discussion and debate. And I think our observations and our discussions with Stefano on the last episode further fueled those debates and discussions if the feedback we received was anything to go by.
Yes, Jonathan, that's right. On it goes in terms of the analysis of the AG opinion. I would say this opinion has probably been dissected and discussed extensively by legal commentators and football agents. There is, I would say, a bit of a pattern of a divergence on the opinion of the effect of this AG opinion. But one thing I would say, no one has said that it's a clear win for any side. It seems like what we said last time, it looks like a draw. We'll know later in the year, hopefully, that when the eyes turn again to the European Court of Justice or the lens they have on the FFAR and agent regulation, and moreover on the agent profession within Europe, Jonathan.
I think the one thing that has emerged following the release of the AG's opinion is that the majority of people are, much like ourselves, still very unclear on what the opinion actually meant, what is likely to happen next, and as you said, who, if anyone, could declare any victories. But I listened back to the discussion with Stefano, read the comments of others, and now with a little more time to reflect, you do form different perspectives of what may happen and also what has gone before and the mistakes made by everyone, not just FIFA. But one thing that we touched upon with Stefano, and something I don't want to disagree with him on, as he is a renowned expert on the legal and EU aspects, is that question mark over whether FIFA will abdicate responsibility for the bulk of agent regulations if they are defeated on FFAR, either as a whole or on a substantial proportion of the FFAR. And Stefano's take was that they wouldn't. And under normal circumstances, I would agree that an international sports governing body wouldn't do that. However, this is FIFA, and they effectively abdicated responsibility for regulating agents in 2015. And thus, I do believe they could follow a similar path. Arguably, the money and the time invested in FFAR and the legal battles may encourage them to tough it out. Alternatively, all that cost and then coming out of it bloodied and battered could see them metaphorically take their ball home and technically abdicate responsibility once again and dismiss it as a headache that they don't really want.
I can't see personally myself FIFA abdicating, Jonathan. I think we've had over 8,000 agents licensed under this FFAR system. We've got actually another exam in 2 weeks or maybe a bit less. There's too much at stake for FIFA to withdraw entirely. And I generally can't see the European Court of Justice saying that FIFA cannot be the regulator of the licenses. But who knows how that issue is going to go. And if it does go against FIFA, who will step up? The Agent Association or UEFA, who's, I believe, with the European Union looking at agent regulation, or other confederations? Or will national associations step up if there is a vacuum? I'm not sure.
But as we've said many times before, a lot of this is all hypothetical. And with the FFAR at the ECJ, we're all very much back to the old position of watching and waiting. But on the topic of FIFA and the FFAR, some may be thinking that whilst a lot of the regulations are up in the air, whether there was any effective enforcement by FIFA of the FFAR going on, beyond that of licensing exams and CPD. And one story that certainly gathered pace over the last week or so since it broke seems to demonstrate FIFA are active in regards to FFAR investigations and possible enforcement. And I think on the face of it, we welcome, if not even applaud, FIFA's apparent attempt to investigate and regulate on such matters. And so should other licensed agents in this case, because this report relates to a matter that is arguably the biggest scourge and problem when it comes to the world of football agency, and has been for so many years. And that is a case of unlicensed agents and unregistered agents who operate largely outside the system and are seemingly untouchable by whatever regulations are in place. And this case, without doubt, features an internationally renowned manager and a renowned footballing nation. However, it comes from a territory where there is arguably no FFAR, and football agent regulations in general are in a state of confusion. And thus, ultimately, if there is a breach of the agent regulations, very little can seemingly be done by FIFA.
Yes, I'll give a bit of an overview and background of the story. Probably one of the biggest coaches, biggest names in international football, Carlo Ancelotti. We saw an article, Jonathan, that there's a FIFA investigation in the 1.2 million payment made to intermediary Diego Fernandes, who's linked to Carlo Ancelotti's appointment as the new Brazilian national team head coach. Fernandes, according to this article, is currently unlicensed, which raises concerns about potential breach of FIFA football agent regulations. Now, the Brazilian Football Confederation, known as CBF, FIFA has requested information from them, including Fernandes's contact details, related documents, and proof of payment or commission. The Brazilian Federation stated the deal was made under a previous administration and it's under internal review. Fernandes himself, he's put up defense claiming that he acted as a consultant due to time constraints and the urgency to recruit big name Ancelotti in terms of bringing it to the Brazilian national team. And Mr. Fernandes intends to register as an agent to receive the appropriate compensation. The 1.2 million fee remains valid as per Ancelotti's contract, despite concerns of the Brazilian Federation about Fernandes's role. So, as you mentioned, Jonathan, Brazil is sort of outside the FFAR. However, the FFAR does apply to international clients and coaches. You know, that's one of our clients, not just players. Therefore, FIFA has looked at this and said there is a case to answer, and that's why the investigation's on foot, Jonathan.
But correct me if I'm wrong here, Peter. FFAR is effectively not recognised in Brazil due to the court rulings. So the Brazilian Federation can't really be sanctioned by FIFA either, as one, the regulator for not upholding the FFAR, or two, as a participant for breaching FFAR, akin to a signing club doing similar with recruiting a coach or a manager. Because isn't the Federation's first duty to the courts and national legislation, and that is even stipulated somewhat in FIFA regulations, that the national law takes precedence in any territory over FIFA regulations? And also, the coach involved is signing a contract in Brazil. So he and the agent activity also arguably falls outside of the jurisdiction of the FFAR, despite it having an international dimension. As such, from my perspective, the only sanctions of a sort that FIFA could possibly impose, if the case is proven, is against the unlicensed agents. But that is limited also, as surely all FIFA could realistically do is reject any future application from him for a FIFA agent license if he were to apply. For which I'm left wondering, from some of the reports on this matter that I read, there is a question as to whether he has applied for the next agent's exam in just a few weeks' time, and if that is the case, how FIFA will handle that. But then again, if there are no FFAR and no agent regulations in that territory, could a relevant argument for him be that in that territory, he doesn't need to be licensed there under FFAR?
Yeah, this is an interesting scenario because, as you mentioned, Brazil is in essence outside the FFAR. but the client's not Brazilian. So the FFAR does apply to coaches because of what you mentioned, the international dimension. And where the FFAR or FIFA enforcement can come into play, for example, if a club uses a licensed agent, but here we're talking about the Brazilian Federation, which you mentioned are under national law. And then there's the other issue of, will this agent be licensed in a few weeks? Is he sitting this exam? And if he does pass, will he try to regulate his status with FIFA? So there's a lot of questions here, but we do know that Brazilian agents are licensed under the FFAR. We know recently that FIFA suspended the agent license of Antonio Teixeira, former representative of Rui Bogus, due to breaches of agent conduct regulations. I won't go too much into that case, but we know the allegation there was that Mr. Teixeira was found to maintain interest in a Brazilian club, over 160 player transfers to Portugal, which raised these concerns. So owning shares in a Brazilian club which had facilitated transfers, and that violated FIFA rules prohibiting such ownership. So this is an interesting one because I don't think, even if this agent, Fernandez, gets the license, say, in 2-3 weeks, Jonathan, you need to deal with the bad conduct that happened before. And that also brings him into the FFAR. And then we have with the FFAR, the client is also responsible. So a player or a coach using an unlicensed agent can be reprimanded or fined, etc. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen, Mr. Ancelotti. However, the FFAR does stipulate that it's not just the agent, but also players and clubs and coaches can also face penalty for utilising unlicensed agents. Now, obviously, we have the Brazil scenario here, which may exclude all that, but that's not clear-cut, Jonathan. So, interesting. I think we need to follow this case.
Another question here, though, Peter, and I'd like your thoughts on this as well. And I'm going to move this as much away from hypotheticals as I can. So I'm going to use England for this scenario. And the reason I choose England is that I think England is one of, if not the only territory where we can accurately say there is some certainty on FFAR and the football agent regulations currently. Because one, it's outside the EU. Two, there has been a final ruling on FFAR there. And three, the FA in England has issued full football agent regulations post FFAR release. So if this Brazilian case had happened in England, who would be liable for sanctions and what might those sanctions be? Because for me, the outcome in that scenario would be very different to how this specific matter looks in Brazil.
This is an interesting pivot from Brazil to England, but I'll do my best. I'll start from this. FIFA requires national associations like the FA, the English Football Association, to implement and enforce the FFAR. That's the basis. This means the FA must establish regulations that align with the FFAR's principle. Well, the FA has to align with the FFAR. It must also consent and comply with UK competition law and the Rule K decision in relation to that. And the big part of that was the knocking back of the caps. So they do not have to comply with the cap requirement of the FFAR. So FA implementation of the FFAR has to be tailored to avoid conflicts with domestic regulations, and in this case, UK competition law. Now, FIFA could sanction a national association if they do not comply with the FFAR's minimum standards. However, the FA has been given obviously flexibility because of that hearing, but they still have to fundamentally follow core principles. However, the other thing we have to remember is that there are a lot of international deals going into England. There's a lot of FFAR licensed agents who are based outside England who need to do business. Therefore, they do register with the FA. So for me, in the answer to your question, the Football Association or the FA have to have compliance with some of the core principles of the FFAR, which they do in their regulations, but they also have a hybrid model. So they follow some FFAR regs that are in place, including what you need to have in the contract. And then they've got the local regulations. And the most important for all of us, agents who are outside England and want to do deals, the registration requirements. But in terms of the FFAR applying or FIFA taking action in the case of England or conduct, I would say, especially if there's international dimension, players coming from the outside, an agent involved from the outside who's FFAR registered, I think it'll be a completely different outcome to Brazil. I think that matter will be investigated. And whether it's a penalty from the FA or a penalty from FIFA, I think you'll have more compliance or enforcement action in an English scenario, as you suggested earlier.
I think you did really well with that curveball there, and you even did it without mentioning the words, it depends. Now, some may be wondering if this apparent leak of a potential investigation by FIFA is all a bit too convenient. I can't see the Brazilian Federation publicising this and leaking a letter from FIFA to the media, and I can't see it being a desired outcome for the agent or coach involved whatsoever. And it certainly provides a great opportunity for a governing body to be seen to rattle the sabre and look like they're being active with regulation and enforcement of regulations, knowing full well they can't really do anything, but still continue the narrative of the problems with agents and putting a positive spin on things from a regulatory sense, if only for their own benefit and image, especially with some very high profile entities involved, such as the Brazilian Federation and the associated coach, if only to maximize attention, exposure, and coverage. But there are plenty of individuals paying close attention to the developments with agent regulations. And that isn't just FIFA and the agents, but also leagues, clubs, coaches, and of course, players, plus the collective associations, organisations, and unions that represent those participant groups. And today's guest joins us from an organisation we've been keen to bring into the conversation here on the Agents Angle for quite some time. We've had FIFPro in our sights as a guest on the show, as they are undoubtedly a key voice in the world of football agents and regulation as a whole. But the timing has been far from straightforward in recent years to enable FIFPro to take up our invitation, not least with the Diarra case before the ECJ and ongoing tensions surrounding FIFA's football agent regulations, amongst other things. So somewhat understandably, FIFPro has taken a seemingly diplomatic stance and considered approach, whilst the legal and political landscape in football has shifted quite considerably in recent times. And with that, we are now very pleased and grateful to be able to welcome someone from FIFPro onto the Agents Angle at such a pivotal time for players, agents, and football globally. I think it reflects a willingness to engage, and we hope this interview marks a point in time for more open and constructive dialogue, all in good faith, of course, between FIFPro, player unions, and the football agents industry. Because whether these groups have always seen eye to eye or not, both should ultimately share the same priorities, most notably protecting the interest of players. So joining us today is Loïc Alves, legal counsel at FIFPro. But Loïc's experience reaches well beyond player union matters. With a background in EU and international sports law, Loïc is contributing to research and education at the prestigious FFAR Institute, written for publications such as Football Legal, and has spoken on key industry challenges from the football labour market to collective bargaining, player rights, and regulatory frameworks across global football. Obviously, a sharp legal mind with insight into both the policy thinking and the lived realities behind some of the most important questions in football today. And today, he helps us explore FIFPro's stance on agent regulation, the future role of national player unions, and where the relationship with agents goes next. So, Loïc, thank you for joining us here on the Agents Angle.
Thank you for having me. I've rarely had such a nice profile as an introduction, actually.
If I may start, Loïc, on the topic of misconceptions, there are often misconceptions of who FIFPro are, who their members are, their authority, and how the organisation's funded and their main missions and objectives. Can you just briefly sum up those aspects for everyone listening, in particular those aspects that relate to agents?
Yeah, there might be some misconceptions. First, we do not depend from FIFA. Let's start there. Often the misconception is that because of our name, we have a relation to FIFA. We don't. It's just an acronym that is similar. So we don't get any funding from them. And our membership is not mirrored on their membership. So we don't have 200 plus members. We have at the moment around 70 members. Our membership structure is rather strict and the access to the membership is quite strict. So, I will not get into the nitty-gritties, but basically, you need to have professional leagues, professional contracts. And obviously, this is not something you find everywhere. And on top of that, we want to make sure we're representatives. So you need to have like a proper player base. And we know that in some countries, it's hard to get enough members to create a union. So those countries are usually not members of FIFPro. And then in terms of mission, there's like a classic union in this sense. We defend the interest of the workers that happen to be players in these countries. Then if I would break down the membership, most of our membership is in Europe. We have like 30 plus members in Europe, which helps having a strong relation with UEFA, not gonna lie. It's a bit more complicated in other continents where, like if you take Africa, for instance, we have 11 members for 54 countries on the continent. So the discussions with CAF are a bit different. And then in Asia, we also have around 10, and then South America, Central and North America. The membership is actually quite strong, except for Brazil, unfortunately. So yeah, labor advice, legal advice. We are not an agency, but again, we will touch upon that because sometimes some of our members do offer services that are quite similar. And then on the funding, I'm quite happy that you're asking because there's a lot of misconceptions around that. Obviously, as I said, nothing comes from FIFA. We are funded mostly based on collective image rights of players. So that's another misconception. We do not sell individual image rights of players. We don't do that. To simplify it, we collect lawfully the image rights of players whose individual value has no value. And collectively, they do have a value because you have to populate, say, video games, for instance. So this is how we found ourselves. We collect those collective image rights from players. The top players, they can license their own image rights. We do not touch that. We do not interfere. And then we sell these collective image rights to the gaming industry mostly. So nothing out of the ordinary, basically. It's like a commercial license that we use. And that's how most of our members are funded, because some of them do the same or replicate the same at domestic level. Because obviously this model starts at domestic level. They have to collect properly these image rights, and then they can sub-license to us or license directly to their own partners. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's how our membership is built and how our funding model works.
Loïc, I know that from various sources, FIFPro were key participants in the new FFAR, or the FIFA Football Age and Regulations, which we've covered on this show multiple times because it's probably the essence of where agent regulation is at the moment. And we know that in terms of the European Court of Justice, the Advocate General gave an opinion yesterday. But my question here is, in terms of FIFPro, is it an accurate representation of that they were involved in, I suppose, designing part of the FFAR? And also, are there any things in the FFAR that concerned FIFPro, and more importantly, things that the FFAR missed in the eyes of FIFPro right now?
Okay, long question. Like if I forget some parts, jump in and add them again. Yes, so we were involved, but it's a classic, there's no but. We were involved. It was a classic FIFA consultation process, right? This one was a little bit longer, obviously, because there were like more stakeholders with direct interest in it. So it took quite a while to negotiate them. But in the end, it works like any FIFA consultation. They decide what they want to take on board and what they don't want to take on board. So it is inaccurate to say that the latest version of the regulations is rubber stamped by FIFPro. This is not true. There's never consensus. It's always FIFA that decides now is the consensus for us, basically. It is true and accurate that we were part of the consultation and that we voiced concerns on some parts and that we were supportive on others. So if you take the cap, for instance, which is always the big subject of discussion, we already voiced our concerns when it comes, for instance, to the dual representation, and then the cap goes up if you have dual representation. Well, you're basically incentivizing conflicts of interest in a way. So this we voiced. But then when it comes to the license, yeah, we were in favor of this. Like our day-to-day is actually dealing with players that are not licensed, that know nothing about the sector. So we do want the players to have proper qualitative service. And we think this comes with a license. Then you can discuss, the content of the exam, etc. But we think the license is, for instance, necessary.
Is there anything you would, as FIFPro, would have liked to seen included in the regulations? Is anything missed by FIFA that maybe not included? You mentioned multiple representation, something that concerned you. The caps, we know we're going to get probably a very impactful decision from the European Court of Justice Although we did get an opinion yesterday, I think everyone's pretty much now waiting for the judges because that would be more indicative of where it's all going to land. But was there anything that FIFPro really lobbied FIFA for and maybe was not included in the regulation that comes to mind?
Yeah, actually, one point, the agent chamber, the way the jurisdiction works, without getting too technical, we think it's too complicated, that we should go back to like a definition of what is international dimension that is closer to what the FIFA Football Tribunal does. Like, quite frankly, at the moment, it's first complicated, as I said, and second, it's not even open. So it would have been appreciated, that like the definition would be clear and that it would be functioning from the start. Now I understand the realities with part of the regulations, that are suspended because of the current cases, but still it's a bit of a headache because, on the one hand, you are advising players on their agreements with the agents, but on the other hand, that you can basically go nowhere or nowhere tangible because these contracts often, don't get me wrong, but like, we represent or have some players that do not deal with licensed agents, which is not problem number one. So then you're like, okay, where do we go for this? And even if the player has a cause to terminate his contract, what is going to happen after that? So we would have liked to see more certainty when it comes to the jurisdiction and dimension. And then this cannot go into the regulations, but it's the enforcement. And this is a broader issue we have with a lot of the FIFA regulations. And often what we say is like, if overnight FIFA decides to enforce their regulations, the football landscape changes because the regulations are actually not terrible. They are not enforced. So that's the other part. It's nice to have them, but the question is like, how do you actually use and enforce them? And then there's, of course, like a political discussion that we can have for hours. What is FIFA's real willingness to actually piss off their members by telling them, please apply our regulations? And this extends to the RSTP, the maternity regulations, these ones now. So it's not necessarily like, I know that agents have like more of an issue with the content of the regulations. For us, it's more like, okay, what do you do with them afterwards?
You're right. I think people have missed the enforcement angle of this, that you still got regulations in place. They need to be enforced to show the market that, these regulations are serious. And I agree with you. And a very interesting take on the agents chamber. Very interesting in terms of how it sort of works with international dimension and also what matters can go there. And as we know, the agents chamber hasn't started. There's been appointed members, but nothing's happened. So we haven't seen what flavor of enforcement or decisions or disputes it's going to have. So that's a very interesting observation. Now with FFAR in place, we saw the creation of the FIFA Agents Working Group. And I know that FIFPro, amongst other stakeholders like the European Clubs Association, ECA, have representation on the FIFA Agents Working Group. How impactful has that involvement been in relation to FIFPro? And has FIFPro seen any developments from the FIFA Agents Working Group that they're particularly happy with? Or is there anything that's frustrated FIFPro in terms of FIFA's Agents Working Group?
We work quite a bit with FIFA, so I don't know if we get so frustrated any longer. Like, we know how it works. But to be very frank and without revealing too much of the discussions themselves, since the injunction, the discussions are very shallow. They don't take place very often. And I think everybody's just waiting to know what's going to be the decision of the Court of Justice, then amend the regulations and restart again. So if you take the latest meeting, which was, I think, like a couple of months ago, they don't even happen that regularly. It's more like an update chamber for the time being. So number of agents that took the exam, number that passed the exam, and kind of trying to brainstorm on some of the few dispositions that were not suspended in the regulations and see how they can be improved. So there's not much to be frustrated about for now. And again, I come back to the agent chamber. Like, that would be the point of frustration because this has to come off the ground at some point. And I guess also for the agents, because like the uncertainties, it must be also pretty annoying.
Now, I want to focus a bit on the relationship a bit more between agents and FIFPro, and not just FIFPro, but FIFPro's members. As you mentioned earlier, the player unions in a lot of countries, close to 70. Over some time, there's been quite a bit of tension between player unions and agents, if not agent associations, in some countries or territories. In your view, why do some player unions have strong positive relationship with agents? And I'll give you an example. In my country, Australia, the Players Union, the PFA, does have a strong relationship, and other countries where a strong relationship between agents and the local Players Union, whilst others seem more sceptical in the relationship between a national Players Union, a FIFPro member, and agents. Why is that the case? Can you give us a little bit of a background and understanding of that tension, or where there is positive relationships?
Yeah, I can give you like some context. Obviously, there will always be individual dynamics that I'm not aware of, but usually the tension arises when the interests are not aligned anymore. And what we always say is a good agent is a friend of FIFPro, because you can actually work together in a way. I mean, you can play good cop, bad cop together. So I personally work quite often with agents. I had 2 agents on the phone today, and I don't see any issue with that. It's the reality that if we want to have the players, you need to be on good terms with the agents as much as possible. So I think the tension comes from the fact that maybe some agents see the union as competitors, and the union sees maybe like the agent as a self-driven entity. Again, I think it's way more nuanced than that. I know that we will probably discuss later, like the question of our unions providing services that are close to agent services. But generally speaking, the way we see it is we're like the 2 sides of the same coin. So the agent has a different scope than the union has in a relationship with a player. And to be very practical, the way I see it is like the agents have a network we don't have to find job opportunities for players, because this is not our job. So this is then the value of an agent, like due diligence towards a club. Is this club paying? How is the situation on the ground? Is the player going to be treated well when he arrives? Can he or she come with the family, etc.? Putting the player in the best position. And then the union is here to actually provide legal service, for instance. So as an agent, you come and you're like, you know what, I don't have this expertise. Can you help? This is why I say it's like the 2 sides of the same coin, because it's just like complementary work that you do together. Now, the reality is also that often, once the player is in the club and you have the first litigation or the first like hard discussions to have, it's a bit complicated for the agent to, go hard against the club. This is the reality, because there's more business involved, and this we understand. And again, this is where then it's important to have like a proper and maybe long-lasting trust between the agents organizations and the unions, because then the agent can come and be honest and be like, you know what, guys, we might need this club for future opportunities for other players. Is there a way that you help with the litigation so that I stay away from it and the players' interests are represented? And often this is a bit where our problems come, is that, and again, there's some nuances, but like when you start having issues with clubs, we have a lot of agents, they just remove themselves from the discussion. And it's okay to remove yourself from the discussion once you have proposed an alternative to your player. But if it's to abandon the player, that doesn't really work, right? So I think a lot of the tension comes maybe from these different interests at different times, and especially when the discussions with clubs become a bit hard, when you have like pre-litigation that starts. But generally speaking, maybe this is another misconception, like FIFPro does not hate agents. This is actually completely untrue. And that would not make us very efficient in what we do, right?
I think that is one of the misconceptions, because I've heard, I'm not going to mention any names, but several people who are critics claim that FIFPro want to represent players in an agent sense and thus go in direct competition with agents. And I think from what you've said there, that's obviously addressed that. But whilst FIFPro themselves may not want to represent players, some national player associations, some who may well be members of FIFPro, do already operate as agents or agencies, whether it be as connected entities or quasi-agencies or behind Chinese walls, so to speak. How does FIFPro view that activity by what are in effect FIFPro member associations? And are there any directives or guidelines for FIFPro that have tried to address what many see as a counterproductive conflict?
Yeah, well, that's actually the guidance. Avoid counterproductive conflicts. And this is a discussion we often have with our unions that want to start this service. And their thinking always starts from the same angle. It's like we struggle to find agents we can trust in our market. and more players are coming to ask if we can find clubs for them. This is often like finding opportunities to work as a starting point. And that's what we tell them is like, okay, don't get entangled in conflict of interest as much as possible. Then the unions, they're also quite independent when it comes to choosing the model they want. And this might be something that you don't really like, and maybe FIFPro should intervene more. But there's like real subsidiarity when it comes to that. We have many unions. I know that England, for instance, where it's in-house. So they actually provide quasi-agent services as part of like a package. And they don't take a share from any transfer or anything. It's more like using the union network to assist, which I think it's also a thin line. But then some have cooperation deals. So the agents understand that legal services are expensive, so they get a deal with the union. They encourage the players that they represent to become a member of the union, and they get free legal advice as a member of the union, and the agent can focus on other services to provide to the player. There's also like this model where they grant informal licenses. It's not the same as the US model. At the moment, it's not like a priority or even a focus to get to that point. But we do have unions that have the resources to kind of rubber stamp agencies. So yeah, there is different models. We do not impose one or another, but as much as possible, we want to avoid conflicts of interest. Otherwise, the credibility is also gone. Like if you blame agencies for having conflict of interest and you yourself apply the same, then it's a bit counterproductive.
And obviously, the important thing here, as we've already touched on, is that this mistrust or this conflict of interest arguably harms the players and the players' interest in the long term. How do you think groups where the agents, FIFPro member associations can build that trust and work towards facilitating that? And what would good cooperation between agents and player unions ideally look like without stepping on each other's toes?
It has to be a practical, pragmatic approach. I think for the time being, the industry is so fragmented when it comes to agencies. It would be very hard for all of us to be able to come with like a one-size-fits-all type of solution for this collaboration, especially if you envisage something like in the US, where the unions are actually like running the exams and they are doing the due diligence tests, etc. There is no priority for that. There is no resources for that. So as I said already, it has to be very practical. So if the agencies need like some support on specific issues, we're open for that. But it is close to impossible for us right now to know if we can trust this agent and not that agent. And maybe this is where the collaboration would make sense, because maybe if the agent side manages to come up with a more unified organization that can take a part of this task, a bit like the bar as for lawyers, which in a way is very similar to how FIFPro works, right? Like we rubber stamp unions at domestic level, because we are only one entity at international level. And the difficulty is that we don't have that yet with agents. And once you would find that where you have like representative organizations on both sides, then you can get very creative with the collaboration. But for the time being, I'm afraid that it can only be kind of project-based and not more than that.
Now, if you look at social media, especially, there's a couple of Instagram accounts, Facebook accounts, Twitter, etc., and also other media. We've seen football lawyers or sports lawyers, especially on the bigger deals, appear in photo opportunities with agents and players signing in big clubs mainly, but also smaller clubs. There's been that proliferation of football lawyers, or I use the term sports lawyers, in the player deal making and player transfer space. Is this a sign in FIFPro's eyes that player representation industry is becoming more complex because we're seeing more football lawyers involved in transfers, in helping player representation in negotiation?
Yes, it is a very complex sector to navigate. I mean, you guys are more experienced than I am in that, but how many people do you need for a big transfer? Like tax, labor, agents, families. So you have a lot of court lawyers that now are a bit like on this thin line. I mean, I'm French, so I'm biased about the example that I'm going to take. But in France, now the authorities are actually getting more strict on what like a barrister can do in the sports field. There's been like a lot of investigation, criminal investigation in this field, which also reflects the sad reality is that the more money there is and the more people you will get with their personal interest. But yeah, it's a very complex industry. maybe that's another misconception actually. Our day-to-day at FIFPro is not to represent the top players. The top players do not need a union, unfortunately. Some stay close to the union, but for services, they don't come necessarily to us. We represent more like second or third tier or fourth tier, those that are making either minimum wage or enough to have a decent living, but will never get into a transfer. Most of the time, they are going to move for free their entire career. They fall under the 80% of players that every year can move for free according to FIFA TMS. Yet we spend our time talking about the transfer system, how much money is this club going to pay for that player? So we have more these other players. And for them, they need agents. This is the reality, because they're going to clubs that have very little resources when it comes to scouting. And who is the scout? The agent often, because the network of the agent is the opportunity for the player to find a job. So this is why, the more people getting involved make it more complicated to trust these people. And I'm not shooting at lawyers in particular, but the work of an agent is not the work of a lawyer. These are two different things. This is what I was saying at the start. Either you're an agent or you're a lawyer. You can collaborate, but this is not the same scope of skills. Okay, if you have a big agency, you can have all of it. But if you're a small scale agency, or if you're an individual, I don't have enough hours per day to be a lawyer. So I don't know how you can do with being an agent and going also to scouts every weekend or every day of the week, because there is football all the time. So again, you probably need to make sure that these sports lawyers have what it takes to understand what being an agent means, and they need to successfully pass the license, in my opinion, and vice versa. Agents also have to be sure that they don't depict themselves as lawyers, because this happens quite often. We struggle a lot with that. I don't know if we will talk about it, but all these agents that depict themselves as lawyers, barristers, whatever, and then you realize that it's absolutely not true, but it's already too late because damage has been made.
Another area where damage has occurred, especially with the agent industry and with players, we've seen prominent voices like Didier Drogba and Jeremy raise serious concerns about fake agents. And not just fake agents, but also agents who bring in loads of players to trials or fake trials. And they could be fake agents, but sometimes they're even accredited or licensed agents. And we know that FIFPro have expressed various concerns about this kind of activity. I think 5 years ago, FIFPro did publish an article or info sheet where 8 or 9 points how to spot a fake agent, and put that as part of their education to the players and maybe the broader market. But in terms of FIFPro's primary concerns when it comes to fake agents or agents involved in fake trials, is more things being done by FIFPro to address these issues, especially now that we've got the FFAR in place, albeit suspended? And how can agent associations and, I would say, ethical and effective and transparent football agents help FIFPro in these efforts in dealing with fake agents or agents who may engage in trafficking of players or fake trials?
Yeah, it's a prominent issue. And you mentioned the campaign we had in Africa with CAF. But again, actually, we're going to use the term misconception quite a lot today. It's misconception that it happens only in Africa. We have it in Europe quite a bit, with actually quite some experienced players, second division, big leagues, that also get scammed. I think it's also good to take a bit of a helicopter view on this one. And these are criminal offenses most of the time. It's scamming, it's human trafficking. So it's very, very hard either for agents, organizations, or for FIFPro, or then FIFA, even though FIFA would have more power, obviously, or UEFA. But it's very hard to find a solution on your own, because none of us have police investigation powers. So this is also where we struggle, and where we struggle a lot is that there's a cross-border element, which makes it even harder to investigate, and often between countries that might not even talk when it comes to police cooperation. What we do is we try to do as much education as we can, because as litigation is very hard in these cases. If you have a case with a Swedish player that gets scammed in the golf, I mean, you can still try to go to Swedish courts, but the money is already gone. So you will have maybe a nice decision, but it's kind of pointless, and it's re-traumatizing for the player, which is also a big thing. We try to tell them that it's okay to get mental support in this kind of case, because you get a lot of guilt feeling coming from it. It becomes a taboo, especially in a sports environment where being scammed by an unknown person is not something you necessarily want to talk about. So we try to also include that into the mental health discussions we have. And collaboration, that's what we did with CAF. We try to have big players talking about it because we don't have the platform that Didier Drogba has, and we might never have it. That's the reality. So there's a lot of education. And we also try to get this discussion to trickle down to the domestic level, because what we see a lot, and you probably see it yourself, is like a lot of agents are being scammed by fake agents as well in different ways, right? Like stealing real pictures from Insta accounts, putting them on the fake accounts to present them as actual agents. It's a real headache. And more you can see that those networks, they are professionalizing. The level of professionalization in these schemes is actually crazy. Some of them have some sort of cooperation with real clubs in Europe. We've seen like a private academy operating in Turkey. And the issue with private academies is that, well, they're not really in organized football, even though in the regulations they're supposed to declare themselves, but we know that enforcement is an issue. Private academy in Turkey, recruiting players in Gabon, but not necessarily young players, like players that are 18, 19, 20. They make them pay like 3,000-4,000 for like a week of trials. And these trials are either bollocks or they are actually fixed so that then they're going to push to another couple of clubs that I think back then were in Moldova. And these players are used for match fixing purposes. So this is just like global criminality using football as a medium. But in fact, it has not much to do with what we can do to fix it. So yeah, maybe that actually comes back to your previous question. This would be projects to work together with agents, because your credibility is also on the line. I mean, these people, they're not agents at all. Just calling them fake agents is a bit annoying because you have the term agent in there. They're criminals. There was actually like a piece about it last week in the French media. It's getting a bit of traction because journalists were not really interested in the topic until very recently, which is good and was a bit of a headache for us because we're not a big organization. We have like 35 employees-ish. So you need to choose like your focus. And this one is always subject to internal discussions because it is criminality. But if we don't tackle it, then nobody talks about it. So if the big media outlet can start drawing attention, and then we come back to like, is it possible for agents to actually have their own ethical tests, on the long run? Agents, rubber stamping agents, or whatever organization that may be, that would also be a useful tool.
And of course, a major bugbear of mine, Peter, as you recall, is the media framing all agents as football agents, whether they're licensed or not, whether they're recognised or not, and the activities they're doing. So that could be a first step. But we're in an area of massive uncertainty at the moment, and just setting aside the ECJ opinion and whatever the outcome may be, in the long term, in regards to the regulation and licensing of football agents, in FIFPro's view, a long-held belief of mine, which I have documented and been criticised for, is that FIFPro should play a greater role in the licensing or accreditation of player agents. And I stress player agents, not football agents, player agents. And we may have already touched on this, Loïc, in terms of the cooperation between agents and the likes of FIFPro and its members. Is the licensing of agents by FIFPro a possibility or even planned for? And if it is, what are the main hurdles to overcome? And if it's not, is it solely because of that fractured nature of the agent landscape and the resources that are available to FIFPro?
It is not planned for, I'm not going to lie. Ideally, we would be able to do that. In addition to the two hurdles you mentioned, there is a third one. At this stage, we don't have any regulatory power. I don't know how it would actually work in the shadows of FIFA, right? That would actually be a different way of thinking the current governance landscape of international football. Now, the concept and the idea of it is, of course, interesting, but it's not a priority. And I don't know, like if you do a bit of fiction and after all these ECJ decisions, if in the near future we have a new governance system, maybe it's going to be like some sort of a shared custody of the licensing system. Because it seems that the European authorities, or at least the Court of Justice, has understood that they can influence a governance system that seems to be slightly broken. And in my opinion, if the European football stakeholders are willing to take the space that they can have, you could throw actually a lot of creative ideas into some sort of a European collective bargaining agreement. And this could be one. Why not? But for the time being, and if we don't do any fiction, then it is not realistic, honestly, for us to do it.
And there we go. That term collective bargaining agreement pops into the podcast once again. Seems to be high up on the agenda when it comes to agents and player representation. Loïc, thank you again for joining us here on the Agents Angle. It's been incredibly valuable to hear your insights and, just as importantly, your openness about both the challenges and the opportunities ahead for agents, players, FIFPro and other player associations. I think I speak for Peter as well when I say we firmly believe that the more constructive the dialogue between agents and FIFPro and its national members is long overdue, and it's got to be encouraged, if only for the benefit of the players we all aim to support. Thank you once again, and we really look forward to seeing more progressive dialogue and conversations ongoing in the future.
Thanks for having me. I hope this was maybe like the first stone in a more constructive dialogue then.
Well, I think it's safe to say that that interview certainly dispelled several myths and misconceptions about FIFPro. And I think the openness expressed by Loïc there isn't just refreshing, but it is reflected by a far more conciliatory tone that I've noted from FIFPro and their representatives in recent times towards agent-related matters. Also, I think it highlighted some similar sentiments from a FIFPro perspective that would be shared by a large proportion of the agent community. As such, why hasn't that dialogue been more evident and productive? Is it down to the agents associations and or FIFPro not making those attempts? Reluctance or resistance at a national level between agents and player associations there? Or barriers placed in the way by others? Because as we understand from various sources, that may well be the case. Because just one example was that during the development stages of the FFAR, the likes of FIFPro and the agents were not consulted in the same forum to discuss things and develop solutions collectively.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of heard that there was different engagement between FIFPro and FIFA on the FFAR. Obviously, certain agent associations and agents also engaged with FIFA, but not all agent associations. And then ECA as well was one other stakeholder that would have been engaged with, but maybe separately. In terms of Loïc, he brought a very informed perspective for me, how FIFPro saw the FFAR engagement and also the role of FIFPro and agents generally. We all know that FIFPro and us agents, we both sit at the same side of the table, especially in terms of players. So there is a close alignment in interest. I think also going forward, sort of underlined the importance of the cooperation between the agents and players unions. And interesting, he also mentioned the role on the FIFA Agents Working Group and how FIFPro saw that. Now, I sometimes visit the FIFPro website, and they do have a lot of articles on agents. None of them relate to the engagement of the FFAR, but they do have the seminal article, which is the 8 ways for players to spot an agent, and also quite a few other articles on agents or fraudulent or quack agents, as some people call them, on their website. So, it's also good to go there and you can search and see what they say on agents. But Loïc, overall, I was surprised, as you said, Jonathan, very refreshing, very open-minded and candid. And also very interesting perspective of also the future of agent representation going forward and where that fell.
But still on the topic of FFAR, because like a bad smell, it has a tendency to linger. However much we would love it to be buried or positively and fairly implemented once and for all, maybe there will be proper consultation over that at some point, which is a view, it seems, is not just questioned by the agent community. But there is, of course, an agent's exam just around the corner, and it's going to be quite different to what has gone before. So at the time this episode will be released, the exam is just 10 days away on the 18th of June, and then there won't be another exam supposedly for a year. Hence, the frequency of the exam is the first change to note. But to my knowledge, that was always specified by FIFA from the first release of the FFAR. So not really a change in that respect. But FIFA made significant changes to the exam in other ways. Not least, it is an online exam that can now be sat remotely, not in an exam location arranged by a national member association. And the details from FIFA surrounding this new format have been quite thin on the ground and seemingly only shared with their closest confidants, of which I think it's safe to say, currently, I am no longer one of those. But we thought that those who already have a licence, those looking to take the exam next year, or even others in the football industry may like to know what the changes this time around are and would like an overview. But I need to point out that this is not directly from FIFA, so there may well be some of the finer details missing or somewhat speculative. As I said, the exam is online and not in a test centre, so there are some added safeguards in terms of invigilation and monitoring that FIFA have implemented. Namely, 1, there will be invigilators for these exams monitoring the candidates remotely, but we're not sure of the candidate to invigilator ratio, or who these invigilators are, or from where FIFA have recruited them. So if there is a FIFA invigilator out there, please drop us a line. We would love to talk to you, in confidence, of course. And from what we can gather, these invigilators will watch via a candidate's second device, such as a mobile phone, which is positioned in the room of the candidate, and possibly also monitor them by a webcam as well. So to achieve this, there will be a pre-exam readiness check for each candidate and their exam environment. And these checks will take place over a 2-week period, which at the time this episode goes out, we will be pretty much in the middle of that 2-week period. As such, because there are invigilators, and we would assume a lot of examinees, candidates have had to book their exam slots. So not all exam candidates will sit the exam at the same time. And finally, the exam will be undertaken through a safe exam browser with the aim of limiting any cheating. But if you look into the darker corners of the internet or know someone who's technically minded, you may find that safe exam browser isn't as safe as some may hope.
Yes, it's a big shift, this exam, from me being a legacy agent, you being a legacy agent, Jonathan, from the days we went to the Federation or to a hotel conference room to have the exam. And even back then, was it like 5-10% pass the exam? Anyway, in terms of this new football agent exam, what most candidates need to know, and it's an online exam, it's a 75% pass rate, the same that applied in the previous exams, 60 minutes, no breaks. And everyone can bring their own technology. The laptop, obviously, the desktop, doesn't matter, but has to have a camera and a mic. And then you mentioned a smartphone is required as a second device for monitoring where FIFA can look at things. And stable internet is very, very important. If you lose your connection, you won't get the time back. And we know we actually had an incident, I think in the first exam, was it England, who the internet wasn't working? So it happens. And I'm not saying it happened in people's houses, but that's very important. But this exam, if you break the rules, you'll be banned, and there's a penalty here going forward. So you'll be suspended from the next exam, which is quite serious stuff. So you can't take screenshots, no talking to others, no one else there. So they're really strict on that. Just like before, if you fail, you can review your answers, but there's no appeals. And you've got to make sure that not only your microphone's working, but your camera is working, very important as well. Now, it's interesting you mentioned the smartphone, how that's going to be used to put the invigilators in to check out the environment. It's an interesting approach, and I'll be very interested to see what feedback we get from that. I think there's one thing that wasn't addressed here is where AI fits in all this, but I don't know, because we're not taking the exam, but I'll really be interested in the feedback of candidates who do take it and how it sort of pans out, Jonathan.
My immediate response with these changes is that, is this a case of overkill or even a case of panic in some ways? And also a case of too little too late, as the genie for me is very much out the bottle, because we've had questionable exam procedures with past exams and licenses granted that arguably should not have been granted. Based on what has gone before, yes, these are positive developments, but this is technically a new incarnation of the exam and yet more confusion. What will FIFA change next year, I wonder? And I can't help but think that this approach was triggered by two things. One, the reports of inconsistency in how national associations ran exams and also the pricing they implemented. And as you said, specifically the technical issues in England, which prompted a situation where candidates were allowed a resit online and remotely. both of which were arguably of FIFA's own making, with an ill-conceived and poorly implemented exam process in the first place. However, I do envisage several problems occurring with this latest exam based on the little information we have. And the main one is the contingency FIFA have in place if things go wrong. Not so much at the FIFA end, as you would presume they've planned for this with things like adequate gaps in exam scheduling. So if there were delays, technical issues, or a lack of invigilators, they have contingency plans in place. But my biggest concern, as you somewhat highlighted, is if something goes wrong at the candidate's end, such as the candidate's exam environment has to change, whether it be the location or the layout, or the invigilator judges it unfit compared to the readiness check, or a candidate's supposed to keep their computer, their room, and their mobile unchanged to 1 to 3 weeks between the readiness check and the exam. What if there's a problem with their devices, their power supply, their Wi-Fi, or the signal on their secondary device? Because if you lost your Wi-Fi, wouldn't you then use the secondary device as a hotspot to take the exam? Then there's inconsistencies with invigilators. We don't know who they are, how they're recruited. Should one choose somewhat harshly a candidate has breached exam rules when they haven't? Because as we know, there are seemingly very limited opportunities for candidates to appeal, and FIFA's decision is seemingly final. And just to finish, invigilators, an exam-safe browser because of the easy manipulation of unmonitored IT devices for a computer-based exam, suggestions and concerns that we know were made to FIFA some 2 or 3 years ago, but FIFA ignored these concerns. Hence, people are quite justified in telling FIFA, on the exam alone, as well as FFAR as a whole, we told you so.
You were one of them who raised some of these concerns years ago. So that's part of the truth that, you raise some of these issues. But I will say this. I'm not a big fan of the new exam system. I understand the logistics and the advance in technology, but I prefer an FA, a Football Association chosen venue, because of one other issue. It builds camaraderie. People turn up, identify themselves. We recall on a very, very early episode that one of the FAs put on a spread. I think it was a lunch, just to build that sort of camaraderie or, connection. So we're not going to see any of that. We know football agencies are a lonely game for a lot of people, a lonely business, probably the most cutthroat business in the world. However, there is that sort of camaraderie as well, and the collaboration is very important. And by getting people together, it's always a good thing. But now I'm going to focus on a couple of emails that we received from the Football Association of England again, and its amendments to the football age and regulations in England for the 2025 and 26 season. They actually came into force on the 1st of June 2025. Now, for those agents who are registered in England, both ones that are domiciled or resident in England, but also, I think I mentioned earlier, a lot of international agents registered with FA, you need to look out for 2 emails, 30th of May 2025 and the 2nd of June 2025. I'll just go briefly through them, but please look at those emails. Now, some of the amendments that have come on board is one that the amendments to the scope of the regulations, they now include all transactions involving an English club. Now, there have been some changes in relation to minors or when you can approach. I think you need to check that. It's to do with the academic year and when the minor reaches the age of 16, but I would look at that age of approach, very important. We know that we don't lodge our agreements with FIFA at the moment in terms of our representation agreements with players, but there's now an additional requirement for an agent to provide a representation agreement into with a club. So club agents, upon request from the FA. This regulation also applies to clubs. So that's an interesting. And we know all the agent forms have been updated, and there's some latest versions there as of the 1st of June 2025. And I just want to mention a couple more, Jonathan, which I found quite intriguing. One is the addition of a requirement for an agent to inform clients of their suspension or their withdrawal of their FIFA license within 14 days. So the onus is on the suspended agent or their agency to inform the clients of that. Also, a bit more strictly going on with these unregistered individuals or unlicensed individuals, Jonathan. There is a clarification regarding the prohibition on And we mentioned this. We mentioned about coaches and clubs and players also being affected by FFAR. In the FA regulations or this update, the prohibition on players, coaches and clubs engaging with or appointing unregistered individuals in relation to football agent service has been updated. So it's not just the onus on agents, but players, coaches and clubs that need to be aware when dealing with unlicensed or, in this case, unregistered individuals who operate in England. So they're just a couple of things. I don't want to overanalyze it, but some interesting changes. And it's good to see that these circulars are coming out and improvements are made in the regulations, Jonathan.
And some people may say, hey guys, we got this email and we know all of this, so why are you covering it? But the reason why we're highlighting it, as Peter pointed out, these are important changes every agent operating in connection with England should be aware of. And there are a lot of people registered with the FA. Plus, we have to realise the email may have been missed, whether consciously or in error, as well as the fact that all emails have the potential to fall into the dreaded spam folder. And also, some people connected with the agent world may not be on the FA's email list and would benefit from being aware of these changes. But it is, again, a positive and welcome step from the FA in keeping agents informed. And I have to say, this is something that the FA in England are so much better with nowadays.
Yes, you can see that. And right now, very proactive in ensuring that everyone knows on the same page and where enforcement, compliance, where the regs stand and all the updates are provided. So yes, credit to the FA of England. All right, I just want to focus a bit on football business and transfers. We've just entered June. Transfer windows are starting, and I found a fascinating article from the Premier League website by Ben Bloom. It relates to the 2025 summer Premier League transfer window. And this is an unusual one, Jonathan, for agents need to know that we have two transfer windows. The early transfer window because of the FIFA Club World Cup, which starts on the 15th of June. There's a window open from the 1st of June to the 10th of June, which relates to that FIFA World Cup and allows clubs to register players early. An example would be Trent Alexander-Arnold, who I believe might be moving to Real Madrid in time for this tournament. But it's not just the two Premier League clubs that are a part of this Club World Cup, Manchester City and Chelsea, but all Premier League clubs can sign players during this early window. Then we have the main transfer window, which opens on Monday, the 16th of June and closes on Monday, the 1st of September. So be aware, you can deal with all clubs in both of these windows. I will say a couple of other things in this window, that clubs can only register 25 players and it's 17 are non-homegrown players. So especially for the foreign agents, or agents dealing with other clubs who want to bring players to a new club, be aware that each club has up to 17 slots for non-homegrown players. The other interesting thing is that Premier League clubs must submit lists of players whose contracts won't be renewed. We've had some early announcements. Everton, Manchester United and West Ham have listed some players. And that's interesting because in one way, you know which players are moving on. And agents who are looking for requirements elsewhere can look at these lists and say, okay, that player's been released. I need to find their agent. Maybe it's available for a club or a new market. So having those lists, you might say, oh, yeah, they're not being renewed. They might be free agents or they want to let these players go. But also it's good information for agents in the business to know who's available and who can probably go without a transfer fee so they can broker other deals. So I actually quite like that. I'll finish on one very small article. I'm going to America, Jonathan. I just saw a case. This is an NFL case, nothing to do with football, but it was about an arbitration between two agents. There was an NFL player in 2016 by the name of Kenny Golladay. He had signed with an agent from Clarity Sports. He terminated that agreement in January 2019 and signed with CAA Sports. Now, the agent from Clarity Sports, who was Jason Burstein, accused Todd France of CAA Sports of unlawfully poaching this player. Now, this was an arbitration and then it went to a court. Emails were discovered that there was a poaching situation here, and the court agreed that the agent lost the player because of that poaching. Now, the reason I raise this case, it's an American case, is we know from the ECJ German FFAR cases, the European Court of Justice, and the Advocate General's opinion, that one of the strongest criticism, if the Advocate General does give, is about this poaching rule where If you've got a 2-year contract with a player, another agent can only approach them in the last 2 months. And it seems that may be seen a little bit as anti-competitive. We saw here in America, where, depending on the facts, of course, they're quite strict with poaching. Is Europe going to change in terms of the poaching rule, especially in the FFAR, to go against and not protect agents from poaching of their clients? So I thought that was very interesting. And in America, at least, poaching or unethical conduct can lead to significant financial penalties. Let's see what happens with FFAR and the poaching rules there, Jonathan. From me, I want to say bye for now for this episode, but I thought those couple of articles were quite interesting, especially as we head into the transfer window.
Just one more show for us before the end of the season. It seems like so much has happened this season in the agents world. I think Peter would agree. It's a long slog, and as such, we can appreciate the hard work many are doing for that next FIFA agents exam. So if you are one of those people sitting the agents exam in just 10 days from the time of the release of this episode, make sure your mobile and laptop are charged, if not even a backup mobile as well, that your exam rule is consistent with your exam readiness check, and above all, the very best of luck with the exam. So to everyone listening, from me, take care, and until the next episode of The Agent's Angle, bye for now.
The purpose of the Agent's Angle podcast is to provide news, information and facilitate discussion on regulatory matters, policies, business trends and issues affecting football agents worldwide. The opinions and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only and should never be considered legal or professional advice. Furthermore, the views expressed by guests are their own and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Thank you for listening.